The world really did change on September 11th, 2001. It reshaped so many parts of American life profoundly.
Absolutely.
And one area where you really saw that impact almost overnight was U.S. immigration policy. It just pivoted, didn't it, from focusing on, economics or culture to being dominated by national security.
That day undeniably showed up some, significant vulnerabilities in the systems we had. The government's reaction was pretty fundamental, a complete overhaul, really, of how the U.S. handled its borders and immigration.
And that huge shift and sort of the riffle still spreading out from it, that's exactly what we're unpacking in this deep dive. We're looking closely at the, let's say, complex world of U.S. immigration screening, the vetting processes, how they tie into national security, and specifically how all this connects to a recent reinstatement of travel restrictions.
Yeah, and we've got quite a stack of sources to dig into. We're using reports from the Department of Homeland Security's own Inspector General, the OIG, kind of the internal watchdog. We've also got a detailed briefing document on these issues, some analysis from the Migration Policy Institute, a really interesting paper comparing U.S. and European approaches.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
The actual White House proclamation about the travel restrictions, bits from groups like Human Rights First, who are, let's say, critical of these moves, and even a quick look back at older immigration acts for some context.
So our mission, as always, is to sort through all this with you, pull out the key insights, the surprising facts, the main arguments. We want to help you understand the systems, the challenges they still face, according to these reports, the reasons given for recent policies, and the criticisms, too. Just a clear picture based only on what's in these documents. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the biggest organizational change right after 9/11 was creating the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, back in 2002. It was massive. They pulled together something like 22 different government agencies.
22? Wow.
Yeah. And a huge part of that was getting rid of the old INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and splitting its jobs into three main pieces inside DHS: Customs and Border Protection, CBP, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS.
And the stated reason for doing all that, bringing them under one roof, was what? Better clarity. Coordination?
Exactly. Better coordination, sharper focus, trying to fix those gaps the 9/11 Commission pointed out later. That was the goal.
But the reality, according to the sources,
it's been uneven. Despite the huge restructuring, the billions spent, success hasn't been consistent. You've still got old computer systems that don't properly talk to each other.
Still, after all this time.
Yep. And even missions that overlap between agencies. Like the Migration Policy Institute analysis points out overlaps between ICE and the FBI that sometimes muddy the waters, undermine that clarity they were aiming for, and maybe pull attention toward newer priorities.
And speaking of challenges, those OIG reports you mentioned, they don't really mince words about ongoing problems with screening and vetting, do they?
No, they're quite direct. A key finding from the DHS OIG is blunt. DHS needs to improve its screening and vetting of asylum seekers and non-citizens applying for admission into the United States. That's pretty significant coming from their own watchdog.
And they get into the specifics, right? Like technical problems holding things back.
They do. One big issue the OIG highlights is CBP not being able to fully access certain biometric data from the Department of Defense. We're talking about DoD systems like ABACE, their main biometric ID system, and the Biometrically Enabled Watch List, BEWL. The report says because of ongoing technical limitations, DHS's main system, IDENT, couldn't pull in a lot of the DoD's biometric records.
How many records are we talking about, did the report say?
It's specific. The May 2023 OIG report says IDENT couldn't ingest over 260,000 DoD biometric records.
They wanted 60,000.
Yeah, that's about 10% of those records. And critically, the report says these included things like single fingerprints or face-only records, exactly the kind of data that's increasingly important. If you can't pull those into the main DHS system, it definitely hampers comprehensive checks.
Wow, okay. 260,000 records sort of stuck outside the main system. And what about USCIS, the agency handling green cards, citizenship? How's their screening described?
USCIS does run extensive checks, absolutely. But the sources say their process relies on reaching out to other agencies for key info. They don't have, automatic real-time access to all the relevant databases.
So it's not seamless.
Not entirely. A key example is the FBI's big fingerprint database, IAFIS. USCIS can ask for checks against IAFIS, but it's not an automatic feed. It still involves manual requests, interagency coordination. Checks happen, yes, but the systems aren't fully knitted together.
This kind of leads into that comparison you mentioned earlier, the one of the sources between the U.S. and Europe's approach after 9/11.
Yes, that paper points out a really striking contrast. The U.S. put a much, much heavier emphasis on physical borders, on control measures. Europe, while obviously concerned about security too, tended to focus more policy-wise on immigrant integration, managing populations already there.
And the paper suggests maybe the sheer length of the U.S.-Mexico border influenced that U.S. focus, and maybe a perception of threats being more external.
Right. That seems to be the argument. And you definitely see that focus reflected in where the money went after 9/11. Billions poured into Border Patrol for fencing, drones, UAVs, cameras, sensors, all sorts of surveillance tech on the southwest border.
And did that investment show results, according to the sources?
Well, the sources do note that this investment period did coincide with historically low numbers of apprehensions on the southwest border by fiscal year 2017. So it suggests an increased ability to detect and deter crossings between the official entry points.
Okay, so you see the money, the goal of securing the physical border, and data showing fewer apprehensions there. But the sources also push back against this focus, don't they?
They do. One analysis argues pretty strongly that resources and political attention got steered away from core DHS national security missions.
Like what? What do they consider core missions?
Things like cybersecurity, protecting critical infrastructure, disaster response. This analysis argues that instead, the resources flowed disproportionately towards immigration enforcement aimed at what the sources call low-risk unauthorized migrants and asylum seekers.
That's quite a claim-shifting focus from potentially major threats like cyber attacks to groups some analysts see as low risk.
And the spending numbers cited are, well, they're huge. The sources point out that in fiscal year 2018, total spending on immigration enforcement actually exceeded the combined spending of all the other main federal criminal law enforcement agencies.
All of them combined.
Combined, we're talking $24 billion total for immigration enforcement and $16.3 billion of that just for CBP. That's a massive slice of the resource pie.
And here's something I found really surprising in the sources. It kind of flips the script on where the biggest security weak spots might be. We hear so much about the border between the ports of entry, but what does the data show about where illegal stuff is actually caught?
This is a really striking detail. The sources show that bad actors often try to exploit the massive volume of legitimate traffic coming through the official ports of entry, the POEs. Get this. Between fiscal year 2012 and 2016, 81% of the hard drugs seized at the U.S.-Mexico border were stopped at the ports of entry by customs officers.
Wait, 81%. Not by Border Patrol out in the desert, but at the official crossings.
Exactly. Stopped by CBP officers at the POEs.
So despite all the billions for walls and tech between the ports, the sources show over 80% of hard drugs were caught at the gates. That's a pretty eye-opening stat. It really challenges that common picture.
It certainly suggests, as the sources argue, that the weak links aren't always out in the remote areas. They can be right there in the bottlenecks, the sheer volume of people and goods passing through the official crossing points themselves.
Which brings us right to a specific policy the sources focus on. The Trump administration's emphasis on national security in immigration, leading to the reinstatement of travel restrictions.
Correct. The sources talk about Executive Order 14161, which told agencies to assess the risks coming from various countries, terrorism risks, national security risks, and that assessment then led to a proclamation signed on June 4th, 2025.
And this proclamation banned or restricted entry from 19 specific countries. What were the main justifications given in the document itself, according to the sources?
The proclamation, as the sources lay it out, listed several key reasons. Things like perceived problems in those countries' own screening and vetting, a claimed lack of cooperation and sharing information with the U.S., concerns about high numbers of their citizens overstaying visas in the U.S., and the presence of terrorism or terrorist safe havens in those countries.
And it wasn't the same restriction for all 19 countries, was it?
No, that's right. The White House fact sheet and the proclamation itself, cited in the sources, break it down. 12 countries got full restrictions, most types of entry suspended. Examples given include Afghanistan, Iran, Somalia, Haiti, Burma.
Okay.
Then the other 7 countries face partial restrictions. These mostly hit specific types of non-immigrant visas, like for tourists, students, temporary workers, the B1, B2, FMJ visas. Examples there included Cuba, Venezuela, and Burundi.
And the proclamation actually named specific reasons for including certain countries, right?
It did. For instance, Iran and Cuba were explicitly called out as state sponsors of terrorism. It mentioned a lack of a competent central government that could reliably issue ID documents in places like Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen. Terrorist safe havens were specifically mentioned for Somalia, and those high visa overstay rates were cited with numbers like Afghanistan's 29.3% rate for FMJ visas, or Burma's even higher 42.17% rate for those same visas, according to the DHS report referenced.
And the legal justification cited in the sources, where did the authority come from?
Well, one source notes the Supreme Court decision in Trump v. Hawaii. That case upheld the president's authority under Section 212 of the Immigration and Nationality Act to restrict entry for national security reasons.
So that court case provided the legal underpinning they cited.
Exactly. But the proclamation itself also included quite a few exceptions. It wasn't intended as a total ban for absolutely everyone from those countries.
What kind of exceptions were listed?
Things like people who are already lawful permanent residents, green card holders, also people who already had valid visas issued before the proclamation came out, certain specific traveler categories, dual nationals using a passport from a country not on the list, and people whose entry was considered in the U.S. national interest. The sources give an example like athletes coming for major international sports events here.
Okay, so that's the policy and the stated reasons from the sources. But as you said, the sources also cover the criticisms, the pushback against these restrictions.
Oh, absolutely. And you see this clearly in sources like Human Rights First or analysis in places like the Christian Science Monitor. Critics, including many Democrats in Congress and human rights groups, were very vocal. They called the ban things like reckless, discriminatory, and drew direct comparisons to the earlier travel restrictions often referred to as the Muslim ban.
And they challenged the basic idea, right, that these specific countries actually pose such a high threat.
That's a core argument highlighted in the sources. One source quotes a Cato Institute expert who looked at the historical data. This expert pointed out that between 1975 and 2024, only one person from any of the 19 targeted countries actually committed a terrorist attack on U.S. soil.
Only one in almost 50 years.
According to this expert's analysis, yes. And based on that, the expert argues the threat of foreign-born terrorism and crime is manageable and small. So directly disputing the idea that these countries represented some kind of unique, outsized security risk needing these broad bans.
What about those visa overstay numbers the proclamation used? Were those statistics seen as solid, according to the sources?
That's another point of criticism the sources raise. Even the government's own visa overstay statistics, used as partial justification, have faced questions. The analysis we looked at said some experts have doubted the reliability of these reports for years, saying they involve too much guesswork. So even some of the data points used to build the case for the policy were questioned by outside experts.
Okay, let's shift slightly. Beyond the travel bans, what do the sources say about how a, say, regular visa applicant gets screened? Someone just applying for a tourist or a student visa normally.
For a standard non-immigrant visa, it's designed as a multi-step process. You apply, then usually there's an interview at a U.S. consulate overseas. But before that interview, a system called Patriot checks your information against various DHS and other databases. Then, even if you get the visa, you get checked again by CBP officers when you physically arrive at a U.S. airport or border crossing.
And the Visa Waiver Program, VWP, where people from certain countries can come for short trips without a visa. How's that handled?
The VWP is generally a less involved process than a full visa application. DHS mostly manages it. Travelers fill out an online form, the Electronic System for Travel Authorization, or ESTA. That application gets checked against security and law enforcement databases.
But there were changes to that too, weren't there?
Yes, the sources note that after 2015, rules changed. If you'd recently traveled to places like Iran, Iraq, Syria, or Somalia, or if you were a dual national of one of those countries, you couldn't use the VWP anymore. But even with reforms after 9/11 to strengthen the VWP, the sources say Congress has still worried that VWP countries don't always share all the data they should, and that terrorists could potentially try to use VWP passports.
Now, there's one group the sources consistently describe as having the most thorough screening of anyone coming to the U.S.
Yes, this is a really key point that comes through strongly. Refugee screening is repeatedly identified as the most rigorous, the most thorough vetting process for any group seeking entry, immigrant or non-immigrant.
Why is it considered so much more intense than even a visa application?
Because it involves so many different U.S. agencies, DHS, DOD, the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, the State Department, it's not just one check. It's a whole series of steps, and it's recurrent. That means the vetting happens again and again throughout the process, which often takes years for refugees.
Years?
Often years, yes. And the sources are very clear. If there's any doubt, any unresolved security flag, even after all that time, entry is denied, period.
That sounds incredibly comprehensive.
It is. The sources basically conclude that a terrorist trying to get into the U.S. would likely find it easier to gain admission through any other process except the refugee program because the scrutiny is just so high. They also state the risk from refugees is generally seen as low, especially given the small numbers admitted compared to global populations, and the vetting process makes it less likely for single military-age males with potential security concerns to get through compared to other groups.
So entry screening, especially for refugees, sounds effective based on these descriptions. But the sources also mentioned a persistent challenge for the U.S. government, tracking people leaving.
Yes, the biometric entry-exit system. It's been a goal for decades, especially at land borders. Screening people coming in is pretty solid. But reliably knowing when someone who entered legally has actually left when their time is up, that's been hard to track effectively on a massive scale, according to the sources. There are some things, like data sharing with Canada. Entering Canada counts as exiting the U.S., and they're testing facial recognition at airports.
But even if the system does identify someone who overstayed, there's another hurdle, right?
Yeah, the question raised in the sources is basically, okay, so what happens next? Because, as they state, there just aren't enough enforcement resources to track down and remove every single person flagged as an overstay. Knowing they're here past their visa date is one thing, but actually enforcing departure for millions is a huge logistical challenge.
This leads to another interesting idea in the sources, going beyond the physical border, challenging the notion that all security has to happen right at the borderline.
Right. This is the strategy sometimes called driving the borders outward. The basic idea is to try and figure out who someone is, what their intentions are, any potential risks before they even get close to a U.S. border.
How do you actually do that, according to the sources?
Mostly through better information sharing and strong partnerships with other countries. Things like having U.S. CBP officers stationed at airports overseas for pre-clearance. You clear U.S. customs before you board the plane.
I've done that, actually.
Yeah. It also involves setting up direct data sharing with countries, especially those European VWP partners, maybe offering tech help or intelligence so they can use U.S. terrorism info and access shared biometric data.
And this borders outward idea applies closer to home, too.
Definitely. The sources stress how important it is to work with partners in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica are mentioned to help them manage migration flows further south and help them spot potential risks moving north before people reach the U.S. southern border.
And one source makes a specific argument about how effective this partnership approach is compared to just building walls.
Yes, there's a strong argument presented that helping these partner countries get better at identifying threats, collecting biometrics, sharing info with the U.S., that this is much more effective and actually a better value for money for national security than just relying on physical barriers like a wall.
Because walls can be overcome.
Exactly. The sources point out that physical barriers, while they might deter some, can be gotten around tunnels, boats, or just using fake documents at a regular port of entry. Investing in that international cooperation and intelligence sharing is framed as a more sophisticated and ultimately more effective way to catch complex threats.
So if we try to pull all these different threads together from the sources, the post-9/11 changes, the system challenge is still there, the debate over physical borders versus ports of entry, the travel restrictions and the criticisms, the different screening levels pushing borders outward. What's the main tension or the big picture takeaway the sources seem to point to?
I think the central tension that emerges from reading across these sources is this. You have an undeniable need for real effective security measures, but that's balanced against a significant risk. The risk that huge amounts of resources, political focus, and maybe even public attention get diverted away from what some sources call meaningful threats.
Meaningful threats.
Like pandemics, sophisticated cyber attacks, large-scale transnational crime. The risk is diverting focus from those things towards groups that some analyses suggest pose an extremely low threat, like asylum seekers or refugees who undergo intense vetting.
And that diversion isn't just about where the money goes, right? The sources suggest other consequences.
It can really strain crucial relationships with foreign partners, and those partnerships are the bedrock of that whole pushing the borders out strategy, the key to identifying threats early. So the sources suggest this intense focus on certain types of immigration enforcement might actually undermine some of the most effective, sophisticated tools we have for real national security in a globalized world.
So what does this mean for you listening? Well, this deep dive, looking through this range of sources, really shows how tightly immigration policy, national security concerns, and international relations are all tangled together. It shows that policies made with security goals in mind, like those travel restrictions, can hit real challenges in how they're carried out, how effective they actually are, and can have impacts far beyond what was stated, as the data and critiques in these documents suggest. It just highlights the complexity, the different views on where the biggest threats really are, and the best ways to tackle them.
It's definitely a constant balancing act between perceived risks, how you use limited resources, and what actually works in the real world.
And that really leaves us with a final thought, a question drawn from the analysis in these sources for you to chew on. Given that these sources suggest the most serious threats today are often complex, they cross borders easily, and they require really sophisticated intelligence sharing and deep international cooperation to counter as focusing primarily on physical borders or broad travel restrictions, even with stated security justifications. Truly the most effective and efficient path to enhancing national security in the world we live in now. Something for you to mull over.